So I think there are various dimensions on atoms where we could be advancing, and we just have chosen not to.
Why do you think it's so hard to convince people that, because both of us have had this experience where we sit down, let's say, to an interview, and somebody talks about the dizzying pace of change. And both you and I see it's almost objectively true. I have this test, which is go into a room and subtract off all of the screens.
Yes.
How do you know you're not in 1973, but for issues of design? There aren't that many clues.
Yes, there are. Well, there are all sorts of things one can point to. I mean, I always point to the productivity data in economics, which aren't great. And then you get into debates, how accurately are those being measured? You have this sort of intergenerational thing where, our generation, Gen X, has had a tougher time than the boomers. The millennials seem to be having a much tougher time than, either us or the boomers had. So there seems to be this generational thing. So there are some of these sort of macroeconomic variables that seem pretty off. The direct scientific questions, I think, are very hard to get a handle on. And the reason for this is that in late modernity, which we're living in, there's simply too much knowledge for any individual human to understand all of it. And so, and so in this world of extreme hyper-specialization, where it's narrower and narrower subsets of experts policing themselves and talking about how great they are, the string theorists talking about how great string theory is, the cancer researchers talking about how they're just about to cure cancer, the quantum computer researchers are just about to build, a quantum computer that will be a massive breakthrough. And then if you were to say that all these fields, not much is happening, people just don't have the authority for this. And this is somehow a very different feel for science or knowledge than you would have had in 1800 or even in 1900. In 1800, Goethe could still understand just about everything.
Right.
1900, Hilbert could still understand just about all of mathematics. And so this sort of specialization, I think, has made it a much harder question to get a handle on. The political cut I have on the specialization is always that if you analyze the politics of science, the specialization should make you suspicious. Because if it's gotten harder to evaluate what's going on, then it's presumably gotten easier for people to lie and to exaggerate, and then one should be a little bit suspicious, and that's sort of my starting bias.
Well, and mine as well. And I think perhaps sort of the craziest idea to come out of all of this, and again, you met your version of this in a law firm, which is predicated upon the idea that a partner would hire associates and the associates would hope to become partners who could then hire associates. And so that has that pyramidal structure. And in the university system, every professor is trying to train graduate students to become research professors to train graduate students. And I think that, the universities were probably the most aggressive of these sort of things I've called embedded growth obligations. But the implication of this idea that we structured almost everything on an expectation of growth, and then this growth that was expected ran out, it wasn't as high and as stable and as technologically led as before, has a pretty surprising implication, which is, let's not dance around it. It feels like almost universally, all of our institutions are now pathological.
Or sociopathic, or whatever you want to call them. Yes. I suppose there are sort of two ways one could imagine going. If you had these expectations of great growth, great expectations. He's the Charles Dickens novel from the 19th century. Right. Had great expectations, and then you can try to be honest and say the expectations are dialed down, or you can continue to say everything's great and it just happens not to be working out for you, but it's working out for people in general. And somehow it's been very hard to have the sort of honest reset. And the incentives have been for the institutions to derange and to lie. So there's probably a way the universities could function if they did not grow. You'd be honest, most people in PhD programs don't become professors. Maybe you'd make the PhD programs much shorter. Maybe you'd be much more selective. You'd let fewer people in. There would be some way you could sort of adjust it, and the institutions could still be much healthier than they are today. But that's not the path that seemingly was taken. And something like this could have been done in a law firm context, where maybe you you still let the same percentage of people become partner, but the partners don't make quite as much money as before, or something like that. So there would have been ways one could have gone, but those were generally not the choices that were made.
Yeah, I wonder if that's even possible, because if you had a law firm that was honest, or a university that was fairly honest, and you had one that was dishonest, it seems to me that the dishonest one could attempt to use its prestige to outcompete the honest one. And so that would become a self-extinguishing strategy, unless you somehow had like a truth in advertising program.
Yeah, I don't know. I do think the truth, when it breaks through, you're better off having told it than not having. And so it's always as long as everybody was dishonest, it could work.
Well,
it's mysterious to me how long it worked. We had these crazy bubble economies we had the tech bubble in the 90s, the housing bubble in the 2000s, what I think is a government debt bubble, this last decade. And so if you've had this sort of, up-down bubble, that's sort of harder to see than if things were just flat. So if the growth in 1970, things had just flatlined, and you had 40 years of no growth, that would have been problematic, and you might have noticed that very quickly.
Right.
But in a sense, simplifying a lot, you could say we had, the 70s were down, the 80s were up, the 90s were up, the 2000s were down. So 2 down, 2 up, net flat. But it didn't feel that way internally. There was a lot of excitement, a lot of stuff happened. And so, there's and California was like a even more extreme version of this. The last 3 recessions in California were much more severe than in the country as a whole. The recoveries were steeper. And so California's felt incredibly volatile. The volatility gets interpreted as dynamism. And then before you know it, 30 or 40 years have passed.
One thing that I'm very curious about is how this discipline seems to have arisen, where almost everyone representing the institutions tells some version of this universal story, which, I'll be honest, to my way of thinking, can be instantly invalidated by anyone who chooses to do so. It's just that the cost of invalidating it is quite high. Paul Krugman wrote this column called A Protectionist Moment, where he said, let's be honest, the financial elite's case for ever freer trade has always been something of a scam. And so you had people who were participating in this who seem to have known all along that there's no way of justifying this on paper, but yet were willing and able to participate with seemingly very few consequences to their careers. Like, it didn't give opportunities to people who were heterodox and saying, hey, aside from a few bright spots, more or less, we've actually entered a period of relative stagnation. How did this happen? How is it that this feels so?
Well, I think the individual incentives were very different from the collective incentive. The collective incentive, we should have an honest conversation and level set things and get back to a better place. I think the individual incentives were often, you pretend that it's working great for you. It's like if you're, there are 20,000 people a year who move to Los Angeles to become movie stars, about 20 of them make it. And so you could say, well, it's been really hard. Nobody wants to hire me. This is a terrible city. Or you could say, this has been wonderful. All the doors are being opened to me. And that's the second one is more fictional, but that's sort of the thing you're supposed to say if you're succeeding. And I think there's a way. This is how we've been talking about globalization, where it's sort of a glib globalization. It's working great for me, and I'd like to have more people, more talented people come to the U.S. I'm not scared of competing with them, and on and on. So this sort of is this this. Or academia, if you're a professor in academia, so the tenure system is great. It's just picking the most talented people. I don't think it's that hard at all. It's completely meritocratic. And if you don't say those things, well, we know you're not the person to get tenure.
Yeah, it's
so. I think there is sort of like this individual incentive where you're supposed if you pretend the system is working, you're simultaneously signaling that you're one of the few people who should succeed in it.
So one image that I have, and you and I have talked, I use the word kayfabe for the system of nonsense that undergirds professional wrestling, and you've taken to using LARPing, live action role playing. It strikes me that we have two separate parallel systems. Now, this podcasting experiment that you and I are now part of provides for a very unscripted, out of control narrative. And then there's this parallel institutional narrative that seems to exist in a gated form where the institutions keep talking to each other and ignore this thing that's happening that has reached more and more people, so that you effectively have multiple narratives, one of which I think almost no one needs to believe. It's just that the institutions need to trade kind of lies and deceptions back and forth amongst themselves. How is it that these two things can be kept separate? It's like a real wrestling league and a professional wrestling league side by side, where somehow they just don't come into contact with each other.
Well, I think if they came into contact, something they could, then they wouldn't both be able to exist. So I think that's not surprising that they can't come into contact. I don't think it's a terribly, I don't think it's ultimately stable. So I think ultimately, our account is going to prevail. The institutional account is so incorrect that it will ultimately fail. I've probably been more hopeful about how quickly truth prevails than it has, but I would still be very hopeful that that our account is really going to break through in the next few years. I've been talking about the tech stagnation problem for the better part of a decade. And I think when I was talking about this in 2008, 2009, 2010, this was still, a fringy view. It was very fringy within Silicon Valley. And I think even within Silicon Valley, there's sort of a lot of people who've come around to it, who've partially come around to it. There's a sense that tech has a bad conscience. It feels like it's not delivering the promises. Google had this propaganda about the future, and it's now seen as the self-driving cars are further away than people expected. And so I think there is sort of a sense that things have shifted a lot over the last decade.
But even like 5 years ago, I mean, it feels to me, I moved out to work with you in 2013, and I'd never seen a boom before. I mean, this was one of the things that was really important to me, is that being in academics, the academy had been in a depression since this change around 1972, 73. And seeing a boom and seeing people with like flowers and dollar signs in their eyes, talking about a world of abundance and how everything was going to be great. It seemed like everybody was the CEO or CTO of some tiny company. And then very, very quickly, it all started to change. And I felt like a lot of people moved back into the behemoths from their little startup having failed. A lot of the ideology felt poisonous, like don't be evil was not even something you could utter without somebody snickering behind your back. There's like a self-hating component where the engineers have been recruited ideologically and are like not actually there to do business. How did this happen so quickly?
Well, it's.
Am I wrong about this?
No, it's striking how fast it's happened. It's striking how much it's happened in the context of a bull market. So if you describe this in terms of psychology, you'd think that people would be as angry in Silicon Valley as they are today. The stock market must be down 40 or 50%. It's like, people in New York City were angry in 2009. They were angry at the banks. They hated themselves. But, the stock market was down 50, 60%. The banks had gotten obliterated. And that sort of makes sense psychologically. And the strange thing is that in terms of the sort of a lot of the macroeconomic indicators, the stock markets, the valuations of the larger companies, it's like way beyond the dot-com peaks of 2000 in all sorts of ways. But the mood is not like late 99, early 2000. It has this very different mood. And the way I would explain this is that for the people involved, it is sort of a look-ahead function. So it is, yes, this is where things are, but are they going to be worth a lot more in 5 years, 10 years? And that's gotten a lot harder to tell. And so there's been growth, but people are unhappy and frustrated because they don't see that much growth going forward, even within tech, even within this world of bits, which had been very, very decoupled for such a long time.
Now, one of the things that's interesting to me is that when we talk like this, a lot of people are going to say, wow, that's a lot of gloom and doom.
Mhm.
So much is changing. So much is better. And yet what I sense is that both you and I have an idea that we've lived our entire life in some sort of intellectual Truman show where everything is kind of fake and something super exciting is about to happen. Do you share, is that a fair telling that?
Well, I think that I think there's been the potential to get back to the future for a long time. And there have been breaks in this Truman show at various points. There was a big break with 9/11. There was a big break with the 2008
Lehman
crash. You could say there's some sort of break with Brexit and Trump, and in the last few years, it's still like a little bit undecided what that all means. But I think there were a lot of reasons to question this and reassess this for some time. The reassessments never quite happened, but I would say I think we're now at the point where this is really going to happen in the next 2 years to 5 years to a decade. I don't think the Truman Show can keep going that much longer. When I was, and again, I've been wrong about this. So
me too. No,
I've been very wrong.
I've called it.
We had an offsite when I was running PayPal in spring of 2001. The NASDAQ had gone from 2,000 to 5,000 back to 2,000. .com bubble was over, and I was explaining, we're just battening down the hatches. At least our one little company has survived, and we're going to survive. And but the sort of insanity that we saw in the .com years will never come back in the lifetimes of the people here, because psychologically you can't go that crazy again while you're still alive.
Right.
The 1920s didn't come back till maybe the 1980s or something.
We're long-lived.
Generationally, was over. And yet already in 2001 we had the incipient housing bubble, and somehow the shows kept going for 20 years.
Well, with the crazy narrative, like the whole narrative behind the Great Moderation. I mean, I remember just like clutching my head. How can you tell a story that we've banished volatility?
Yes, it's always, I always think of the 1990s narrative was the new economy, and you lied about growth. And then the 2000s narrative was the Great Moderation, and you lied about volatility. And maybe, there's sort of the 2010s one is secular stagnation, where you lie about the real interest rates because the other two don't work anymore. And sort of a complicated way these things connect. But yes, new economy sounded very bullish in the 90s. Great Moderation was still a reason to be long stocks, but sounds less bullish. And then secular stagnation in the Larry Summers form, just to be specific what we're talking about, means, again, that you should be long the stock market. The stock market's going to keep going up because things are so stagnant, the real rates will stay low forever. So they are equally bullish narratives, although they sound less bullish over time.
So that effectively we need what happened with the Roaring '20s followed by the Depression was that there was a general skepticism. And here the skepticism seems to be specific to something different in each incarnation. That you keep having bubbles with some lie you have yet to tell.
Yes, but I think, of course, I think the crazy cut on the 20s and 30s was that we didn't need to have as big of a crash. You could have probably done all sorts of intervention, because the 1930s was still a period that was very healthy in terms of background scientific technological innovation. If we just rattle off what was discovered in the 1930s that had real world practical things, it was the aviation industry got off the ground, the talkies and the movies got going. You had the plastics industry. You had the you had secondary oil recovery. You had household appliances got developed, and by 1939 there were 3 times as many people who had cars in the U.S. as in 1929, and so there was this crazy tailwind of scientific and technological progress that then somehow got badly mismanaged financially by whoever you blame the crash on. And so I think that's what actually happened in the 30s. And then we tried to sort of manage all these financial indicators much more precisely in recent decades, even though the tailwind wasn't there at all.